Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR 96.3, 96.3 HD2, and Sirius XM Channel 141. I'm Bramante Bryant in for Harold Fisher. This is the Insight segment. Well, many of us are caring for loved ones who can no longer fully care for themselves, or some may have professionals who are taking care of those loved ones or friends. Often those efforts are difficult. They can be tough physically and emotionally. Tonight, we're talking about caregiving as it is National Family Caregivers Month. Joining us tonight to have a conversation about this important topic is Dawn Quattlebaum. She's the CEO of Seabury Resources for Aging. Also with us is Dr. Sandra Mann. She's a family caregiver, and Dr. Mann is an only child, and she's been caring for her mother for 3 years. Dawn and Sandra, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for
Thank you so
having us.
much for having us.
Well, let's start. I'll start with you, uh, Sandra. I talked about caregiving. Sometimes we may be, as a family member, caring for someone in our family, or we may have professionals come in. And I mentioned you've been caring for your mom for 3 years now, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Talk to me about what that's been like. Has it been overwhelming? Has it been something things that you expected? What's that experience been like for you?
Sure. Thank you, Ramante, again for having me. It has been somewhat of a roller coaster of an experience. In the beginning, it was very overwhelming, as my mother is only in her 70s. And so when everything started, she was still considered to be fairly young for her age. So to see the rapid decline from her independence to needing full time care was a lot for me to process as her daughter. But then also just someone in society who typically looks at someone in their early 70s as able to care for themselves. So it was quite a process that I experienced, similar to grieving a loss, both on
Mhm.
her side and my side as well.
And Sandra, your mom has Alzheimer's, correct?
That is correct. Eventually, she was formally diagnosed through formal testing through a neurologist. Early on, we did not know what it was. We just saw some unique behaviors, some things outside of her normal personality, and we weren't really sure what it was. We did started with physical evaluations, and eventually we noticed that we had to move to more of a mental wellness evaluation.
And Dawn, does this become more difficult or even overwhelming, as Sandra used that term, during the holidays? We're moving into Thanksgiving, we're moving into Christmas. I would think it becomes even tougher, especially as a family caregiver.
It really does. And Vermonte, again, thank you so much for having me. The holidays are stressful for all of us. So if you can imagine that you're also taking care of someone who's very special to you as a family caregiver, and you have Thanksgiving and Christmas, Kwanzaa, etc., back to back, it can be even more stressful. And most family caregivers are also working. And so it's just a very stressful time. And I would just ask your audience if they know of a family caregiver. And I just have to say, Dr. Mann, thank you so much for your service, not only for your mom, but you're also servicing the community because you're taking care of your mom. But to really assist those family caregivers that you know about in your community, at work, they really need your support in order to be the best for the person that they're caring for. But yes, the holidays are very stressful for family caregivers.
Don, I know in some situations, I could speak in my own. My mom is still up and about, but she's in her late 70s. And I remember early on, I had said, oh, we would never put you into a center or anything like that. And as I've gotten older, I just thought, oh wow, I don't know. I said that like 30 years ago. But what if my sister and I couldn't take care of my mother? And so how do you, that issue, maybe sometimes guilt, you can be a family caregiver, and how do you decide whether or not you take care of that family member at home, you put them in a facility, and if you put them in a facility, are you still really considered the caregiver? Can you talk a little bit about that, Dawn? And I'll ask you, I'd like to hear from you too, Sandra, about that, of that decision, right? Of when do you care for that loved one at home, or when do you hand that over to, say, a professional caregiver, if that's even the correct term?
Caregiving is really unique. Each situation is different. You could be like Dr. Mann and just, she may be by herself caring for her mom. You could have other family members that help, but you all really have to work together in tandem in order to make that decision. And you will know when it's really too much, either for yourself as a family caregiver, or maybe for that person that you're really not providing the quality care that they need and that you want them to have as a loved one. Seabury has a care management service. We've been providing that service since 1995, and we work with family caregivers to help them make that assessment to determine who can be the people that can support. Is that family caregiver doing all the direct care? Maybe you need to start bringing in someone else, and they can assist when it's really becoming overwhelming and you may need to look for a home or more appropriate care outside of the home. But, the three of us here, we know we would prefer to be in our own home. And so when that's the preference, you want to start there. And then you can work your way out. You can work as a family, as I said, or you can bring in a professional. And Seabury has highly experienced professionals to assist with that.
And that's what you do, Dawn. And so to me, that point is so important, but also folks knowing that a resource like yours exists. I would think sometimes too, in those situations, you're so swamped with everything. Where do I turn? Where do I go? Does something like Seabury Resources exist to find that out? So do you just start Googling? Do you go to, I see Sandra is nodding her head, so I'm going to go with her there on that first. I'll let her answer. Is that how it starts for you, Sandra? Did you just kind of have to get on the computer and figure out which way do I turn?
Yes, yes, Bramante, it did. It was Googling, it was making phone calls to the local agencies in the various counties, asking who has senior care services, tapping into friends, tapping into family members, just asking. Once I accepted that this is where I was, I started accessing resources however I could. I agree with what Don said. That there was a wide variety of how I started. So, highlighting my story for a moment, I started trying to do it myself in my home. So it was just me. I transitioned my employment. I did a little bit of everything. I tried to go between her home and my home. Eventually, I moved her into my home. That wasn't working. I saw I needed additional support, so I had someone come into the house for a few days a week. Even that seemed to be a bit much. We went through that cycle for about 2 solid years. And then last year, I had to come to the reality that things just weren't working. Although I had tried many things, it just still wasn't working. It was at that time beginning to affect my own personal health and well-being, as well as I am a mom. So I saw the impact also on my daughter. And so we made the decision that we would enlist a full-time care facility, which was a great idea in terms of me understanding that I could not do it by myself. And I did not have the professional medical care that she needed, because not only was her mental health impacted, but her physical health had begun to decline. And so I went that full gamut again of starting trying to do it on my own because I am the faithful daughter, to the realization that I can't sacrifice my own well-being, because that wouldn't be helpful for her either, to enlisting support with full-time care for her. and even
And
that
also,
process.
Sandra, it's important to note you are an only child,
Yes.
correct?
Yes, I am. Yes.
And so, Dawn, when we talk about knowing when to reach out, right, and ask for help, and Sandra is an only child, and obviously you probably still have Sandra family members you can reach out to. I think it's probably more difficult when you don't have siblings. But Dawn, how do you know when to reach out? Is it a little bit about what Sandra says, when you kind of know when you're feeling overwhelmed, that should be your signal to, hey, I need to pivot and ask for help.
That's exactly right. And especially when it's affecting other aspects of your life, you can look at how it's affecting your mental health, your physical health. What about the person that you're caring for? If you can determine, I'm really not providing all that I should. So all of those factors will calculate into, yes, I need more help. And like you said, Bramante, in terms of Googling and talking to your local or state agency, Department on Aging, they will assist you as well. And I have to answer a question that you asked earlier, Bramante. Even though Sandra's mom is in a community, she is still a family caregiver because she is still overseeing that. She's monitoring it. She wants to make sure that her mom is providing the best care. So I just wanted to pivot back to that. You will always be a family caregiver, whether that person is living in your home, living somewhere else, or in another community in order to receive additional services. But yes, it's really internal. And you can also, when you're talking to other people, they can assist you and say, I've noticed this or that about that. And then you can make a self-assessment. Yeah, I've really noticed that too. I'm arriving to work late, or I'm leaving work early, or I'm leaving in the middle of the day in order to take mom to appointments, just depending on what the scenarios are.
And Dawn, can you talk a little bit about boundaries and how we set those? And that probably could be a whole show in itself. That that you're caring for this loved one, right? But you still have to take care of yourself, and you still have to set some boundaries. And I would think that has to be one of the most difficult things, because you may set a boundary and then you may have guilt over the boundaries that you set, right? Your loved one may have some expectations of you that you may not be able to fully meet. So, Dawn, I'm going to let you start on the boundaries right before we go to break, and how you do that, right, and still do it in a loving way.
It's very difficult, one of the most difficult, because you're caring for a loved one, and especially a parent who has given their life to you. You want to give back, and especially as daughters. I have to say, caregivers are very special. I was a caregiver years ago for my parents. So, Sandra, I know exactly what you're talking about. But again, internally, you will decide, okay, this is going to be my boundary. And people shouldn't feel guilty if they have to change to another boundary and another boundary, because you want to give your all to make sure that you are caring properly for that person. But boundaries are very important. And Bramante, you mentioned something. Respite for caregivers is very important, because if you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to be able to completely take care of someone else. And that's very different. And sometimes you don't realize how exhausted you are, how overwhelmed you are, until you start feeling it mentally or physically. But it is important to set those boundaries as much as you can.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. Dawn, if folks want to get in touch with you or learn more about your services, how can they do that?
Sure. Please contact us at Seabury, SEABURY, resources.org/care management. Or we have a free information and referral line that people can call us at 202-364-0020.
Well, don't forget, you can hear every edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment via podcast on WHUR.com, or you can download the 96.3 HD2 app on your smartphone and hear the program live in its entirety. This conversation continues online and on SiriusXM channel 141 and 96.3 HD2. The original Quiet Storm with Raheem Devon is next on 96.3 WHUR. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM channel 141 and 96.3 HD2. I'm Bramante Bryant in for Harold Fisher. It is Family Caregivers Month, and tonight that is our focus of our conversation, an important conversation as well. Dr. Sandra Mann, we were talking about setting boundaries on the other side, and I saw you kind of put your hand up about the difficulties of setting boundaries, especially if you may have to set them for that loved one that you're caring for. Is that an experience you've had to kind of deal with?
Yes, thank you, Ramonte. It was. When your loved one is going through their situation, their medical situation, their whatever they're experiencing, it's a lot like grief. So those stages of denial and bargaining and depression and all of those things they experience. In that, sometimes they can lash out verbally and physically. And so the relationship between a parent and child, especially when you're an adult, can be challenged because what I experienced with my mother is a lot of the brunt of what she was grieving in terms of her independence, in terms of her not being able to be in full control of her thoughts and things of that nature. I received the brunt of that. It wasn't because she didn't, at the time, she was a little confused about the care that I was giving. So her mind was confused in terms of me providing the best care. To her, felt like I was stripping her life away from her. And so that became a lashing out. I had to learn to set boundaries for myself. And it was through the counseling of people who I trusted, who were familiar with, because they too were caregivers, with professionals who were in caregiving services, through my faith community, folks that just embraced me at church, who really allowed me to understand that I needed to reset the boundary of being her daughter. And so while caregiving continues, thank you, Don, for acknowledging that caregiving continues even when you do need to choose a full-time care facility. The decisions that I had to make, I needed the support to allow me to return to being her daughter, in addition to being a caregiver, versus her only seeing me as a caregiver who was, again, stripping her away of her independence and her rights, and things of that nature.
Did you find that even more difficult, Sandra, not having siblings to sort of lean on?
Absolutely, absolutely. So our family is small, and while I do have family members who I know would do any and everything for my mom and I, it's different because they have siblings, they have parents, they have their own families. And so not having someone who could truly talk it through with me, or for me to lean on, because that was also their mother, right? So that is very difficult because it becomes a isolating space, that, again, you have to be careful because it may start to impact your own mental health, and your own physical health of carrying all of the stress and the weight of the responsibility.
Dawn, let's talk about cost. That is something, it's real, right? And where insurance works with that, and for our listeners out there and our viewers, if they're interested in getting assistance, with caregiving, how does that work? Uh, is the cost sometimes prohibitive of getting some outside caregiving other than what your family may come together just to do and help out?
It can be very expensive. And that's why I'm so proud that Seabury fundraises on a regular basis for our care management program. We have an equity fund in order to provide subsidies for those clients who aren't able to, really pay for the full rate. And actually, our care management program is the only program in this area that provides subsidies, but it can be very expensive. You can go from collecting from family members. You can also talk to your county or your state to see if they have some financial assistance. There are some home care agencies that also provide subsidies. But then, of course, you have not only regular commercial insurance, but you can have Medicare and Medicaid. That's a lot to navigate. And again, I just have to mention, our care management service, and there are other care management agencies in the area that can help you navigate those challenges, because it can be very challenging and very expensive. And then, of course, if you do move to a community, then you also have to consider those costs as well.
You use the term community, and I'm wondering, I think when we hear nursing home, that sounds so much different than a community. And you can share the other terms that are used, but I think when you hear nursing home, you're like, oh, we can't put our family member in a nursing home. It almost really has a negative connotation. Tell me if I'm right or wrong there. I see you both nodding, right?
You are so right. And I have to say, at Seabury, we don't use the word facility. Because the facility to me means a workplace, an industrial place. These are residences. These are where people live. This is their home, sometimes until the end of life. And so we never use the word facility. So I use the word community, which could be independent living, assisted living, congregate care, or nursing home. But there is negative connotation. And it's also a negative connotation of saying, what, you're going to be moving your loved one from their home to another place. But you have to focus on what is best for that loved one. And if they need, such as Sandra talked about, medical care, as well as other services, if you can't provide that at home, even with a home care agency, you need to go to a place where they can provide that. But yes, costs can be very prohibitive, but there may be a combination of sources in order to assist people to afford it.
Well, you really answered my next question about when you make that decision. And Sandra, I apologize because you were giving so much good information. I may have missed whether or not your mom is outside of her home now. Is she or is she not?
Yes, she is outside of her home now.
Right.
She is in a care community. Thank you, Don, for acknowledging that it is a community.
Yes.
Yes, she is now in a care community. But even with that process, we started in a much larger, more commercial care community, and now she is in a smaller home-based care community, which I have found to be a better fit for her. But I want to point out to anyone listening that there is no one size fits all. So there were many benefits and great things, qualities that came from the larger care facility. But I realized for my mother that she needed a much smaller, more specific and directed care community. And that took some understanding of me being carefully involved in her care, always there, regularly talking with her caregivers, her active 24-hour caregivers, and things of that nature, for me to really make that decision of what she specifically needed. So if anything, I want listeners to hear, there's no one size fits all, and there's no right or wrong. You have to figure out what's best for your family member.
I'm going to focus, Dawn, kind of on that word that Sandra used, the wrong. And for families, especially caregivers, are there some things, though, that we are wrongs that we really should try to stay away from when we're caring for loved ones? I would think there's got to be some things there. Is no. These are no-nos. And if they are, can you share any of those?
Sure. I would just say the main one would be, if the loved one is not receiving the care that they need, it is wrong to continue in the same pattern. That is a time for change. And so adjustments need to be made. I would say that would be the first one. Also, if the caregiver is really becoming overwhelmed, really becoming exhausted, it is wrong to continue down that road. Because as I said before, if you are not taking care of yourself, it's going to be very difficult to take care of others.
Would you agree with that, Sandra?
I do. I absolutely agree. Yes.
And Sandra, did you, back to the cost issue, was that ever a factor in any of your decisions in terms of providing care for your mother?
Absolutely. We didn't have a plan. So we didn't have a plan. My mother did not have an estate plan. She did not have long-term care. And these were things that we didn't talk about. As for her and her family and her generation, how she grew up, we didn't talk about these things. And so therefore she didn't plan. And I had to, that was part of my process of uncovering what benefits she had, what she didn't have, the challenges of going through the process of becoming her power of attorney, to be able to talk with Social Security and go through the process of being added as one of her grantees, the term, and just going through that process of being able to help everyone to understand that, no, I need to be her caregiver because she's no longer able to make decisions for herself. And so through that process, the financial responsibility of not only going through her finances, but then also supplementing her care has been a lot. And through there, while there are some great subsidy programs, if you have a retirement pension or some type of income above a very minimal level, then quite often you're not eligible for subsidies. And so the challenge of that also, and then the care community that you select, or the in-home care that you select, all of that, the specialists that she had to see to be fully evaluated and cared for, all of that is a tremendous financial burden that, again, we weren't prepared for. But I am thankful that we've been able to navigate, or I've been able to navigate that for us.
Sandra, you're sharing so much important information here about just through your experiences. And Dawn, and I'm sure you've probably seen it all. And what Sandra was saying about having a plan, boy, that's got to be like so far up there on the list. And many of us who may have older parents, beyond caregiving, end of life, all of those things, having a will. And so here Sandra is dealing with, wow, we've got nothing, and you're sort of starting from scratch. Can you talk about your experiences? And I'm sure you've probably seen that, right, with your enterprise, dealing with folks coming in and they're sitting down and they're going, where do we go? What do we do? How do I get power of attorney? How do I get access to the funds that we may need to have the help from CBERI?
It is so important, and I have to applaud Sandra because, she has been doing all the right things. And as I said before, she pivoted and made adjustments when needed, from going from one location to another in terms of benefits, pooling money together, but also looking for subsidies. It's very important. It's important for all of us, Bramante, to have a plan. Because if we have a plan now, then we will assist those who will care for us later. Because we hope we are blessed enough to age, and we want to age successfully and age well. But yes, I have seen situations where people didn't have anything in place. And Sandra, you had to build upon the insurance and et cetera in order for things to go as smoothly as possible. Our care management service provides educational presentations. We're having one tomorrow, so certainly check our website for that. But it talks about preparing for retirement, preparing for caregiving, all sorts of topics. It's very important to really look for those types of training and those types of sessions in order to be prepared, because if you don't, you will not be prepared, and it will be even more challenging than you can ever think of, and it will be more expensive than you can think of.
Dawn, is it even more particularly challenging if you have older parents, right? But you are, you're a child, not a child, but you're the child of the parent, but you're young. Say you're 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, and your parents are a little older, and maybe not even be older, but you have to care for them. Are those challenges even more challenging, for lack of a better word, depending on the age of the person who has to then be the caregiver.
Absolutely. I mean, when you're that young, when we were that young, we thought we knew everything, right? And now we know much better, right? So when you think you know something and you find out that you don't, and then you have to turn here or there to find those resources. And that's why I'm so proud. Seabury celebrating its 100th anniversary, by the way, that we have those resources and we're expanding on them. But it can be even more challenging for a young person. May I just for a second, Bramante, just share two statistics
Sure.
that there 1 in 4 people over 50 are family caregivers. Just imagine that. And 70% of caregivers report difficulties in providing that service to their loved ones. So if you are a full adult, very wise, and it's already challenging, you could just imagine how it can be for a young person. So that's why it's very good. You can start with as I said, your local or your state offices. You can contact nonprofits like Seabury Resources for Aging and others to help you navigate through that journey.
The Department of Health and Human Services, I guess back in September, they released a report on support for family caregivers. And it was interesting, just sort of in the wording on some of the bullet points of what they said the strategy and what the report sought to do. A lot of the words was needing to recognize assistance, support. Some of it says align federal, state, tribal, local, and other stakeholder responses to a set of goals and outcomes informed by thoughtful recommendations, foster collaborations within and across stakeholder groups. A lot of that is kind of verbiage. But what I thought was interesting is prioritize efforts to advance equity for unserved and underserved populations of caregivers. Dawn, how would you describe unserved and underserved populations of caregivers? Hope I'm not setting you up for a question you couldn't answer.
No, that's okay. I will just say briefly that there are lots of people who don't have the financial resources. There are lots of people who don't have knowledge about local resources. And then you have people who, especially this is not a rural area, but in rural areas, that they may not have access to those services. So underserved and low resource persons are out there. And that's why we try to do as much marketing as we can. We provide care management services in the DMV. So it's not just DC, but also counties in Maryland, as well as Northern Virginia. But there are people out there. I'm very proud that Seabury provides as our essential mission affordable services, so affordable housing as well as affordable services, because there are people who just don't know where to turn. And when they do turn to those places, they can't afford them. So then they go back into their shell and say, okay, I guess I have to do everything. And no one can do everything. You need support as a family caregiver and as a part of our community.
And Dr. Mann, you are an educator, correct?
I am a retired educator, yes.
Chief of staff
Yes.
in your church. So you are a busy person.
Yes, I am.
And in some ways, you've, I guess, released some of the day-to-day in caring for your mother. Would that be a correct description?
Yes, the hands-on,
The hands-on.
yes.
Right.
The mental part never stops, but the hands-on, yes.
So I'm going to go back to something I was talking about early on, though. When you had to release that, and for those out there who may be listening who are finding it difficult to sort of let go of that, right? An experience I remember, I could say it was my grandmother was caring for my grandfather, and he had Parkinson's. And at this time, she was probably in her late 70s. And part of his Parkinson's is his limbs would stiffen. And so she would have to go in and, turn him. And I was visiting one summer, and she asked, my grandfather started calling me in there to do it. And my grandmother was able to get sleep, but I was trying to move him, and it was so difficult. And my grandfather was a veteran, and I remember how difficult it was for my grandmother to have to release that and let him go to the Veterans Hospital because she just couldn't do it anymore. And so I wonder for you, what was that like to kind of have to release that day to day, caring for your mother in her presence? What was that, and how did you finally come to the decision? Well, you talked a little bit about it, but let me simplify it. What's it been like for you to have to release it? Was it difficult for you emotionally, or was it just something where you said, I can only do so much?
No, it was difficult, and it continues to be difficult,
Hmm.
especially around the holidays. So so there's a high level of trust that I had to lean into, to trust that folks who were strangers to us would be able to care for my mother the way that I wanted her cared for. There is a level of trust that she would understand at some point, as best as she could, that I was making the right decision for her. A level of trust that it wouldn't damage the relationship that I remembered most of my life. Um, it is an ongoing challenge. The process, the days when, so the two experiences of me having to enroll her on that very first day in her new community was very hard, very, very
Hmm.
hard. Everything, it was very unsettling for her and very unsettling for me to watch and to experience. The, the welling up of emotions was hard to navigate. It stays with you. It's very traumatic. I want to share that and be honest and transparent. It's very traumatic. It's traumatic because your loved one is moving into a place that's very unknown. So it's an unknown space, unknown people, unknown environment, and not having a sense of why they're even there if they are experiencing some form of dementia. Even if they are experiencing a physical need of maybe going to rehab, some of my friends have, their parents have had to go to a rehab facility, maybe even for a short period of time. It's that sense of, why am I here? I don't need to be here. Again, that bargaining and that going through the sense of the grieving process with depression and things of that nature. Not only do they experience it, but I experienced it too. So I was trying to bargain. I was trying to bargain with myself. I was trying to bargain with family members of, how else can you support me? I was trying to, as a person of faith, I was bargaining with God about, why is this happening? And why do I have to experience this? And why is it so hard? All of those things. And so the transition. So when I made the decision that the first care community wasn't the right fit for her and we needed to make a transition, I had to relive that all over again, and so did she. And so it takes it for her, it takes about 2 months for her to settle down. And so just imagine being in a heightened state, day in, day out, not sleeping for days on end because you're in such a heightened state. And so all of that, from, when she had a cell phone, her calling me constantly and leaving me voicemails of her disappointment and her anger and all of those things. The inability to kind of focus on the things that I needed to do for me to be a mother to my daughter, for me to be a principal leading a school, for me to do my work here now, as chief of staff in my new role. All of those things, they don't go away, so that the daily living and the daily working continues, because all of that is still happening. And even now that she's settled, it still weighs heavy because now it's the holidays. And our family is accustomed to gathering for the holidays with everyone. And she's one of those people that would make her macaroni and cheese or her famous dish or this or that. And we won't be able to do that.
Dawn, and thank you for sharing that, Sandra. You mentioned that 70%, and I think you put an age of it, over 50, are dealing with some difficulty, and Sandra may not fall in that category because she's about 35 probably, so she's not in the 50 plus category yet. But what you hear Sandra expressing, is that similar to what you've seen from those caregivers? I just can't even imagine, as Sandra was telling that story, we all may be in that position, at some point with our loved ones. And it's just, it's hard to just imagine. As she was talking, I was imagining that, of having to take your parents somewhere and really hand them over as those roles change to someone else like Dawn Quattlebaum and her community to take care of them. So how does someone in your position, are there services available to someone in Sandra's position who would come to you and leave their loved one in your hands, but yet someone like Sandra is having difficulty? Are services provided for them with your community?
Absolutely. I would say with our care management service, we not only provide support for the older adult, but also for caregivers. And our care managers are licensed social workers. And so they also can provide counseling. And that's very important. It's extremely emotional, just as Sandra outlined. And it can be relived day after day after day, especially when the older adult, it's just not understanding, why aren't you focusing on me? Why aren't you doing what I want you to do? Why am I here? Why I can't be either at home or with you? And just imagine if your parent is saying that time and time again. It's very emotional. So we provide that support with caregiving. We also have caregiving respite services that we can refer people to. And that's why I mentioned the information and referral line is very important, just to pick that up. No cost, to say, this is what I'm going through. Do you know of services in this particular county, or, in Northern Virginia, Anne Arundel County, et cetera, et cetera? It's very important to be able to do that because it's so emotional. And it will always be emotional because that's someone that you love and someone that loves you. You know why you're doing it, but if they don't understanding, it can be very, very challenging. So as I mentioned, 1 in 4 people over 50 are caregivers, and 70% are saying that it's challenging for them and it's difficult because you are managing so many different things in your life. And what Sandra is, she's a part of a sandwich generation. So she's caring for a child, but she's also caring for an adult. And we have encountered and worked with many caregivers in this area for decades. So I'm just so proud that we provide that service.
Before we finish up, Dawn, I want to make sure folks know, if they want to get in touch with Seabury Resources or learn more about family caregiving and what they may need to know, any websites or information you can share with our listeners and viewers.
Absolutely. So I wanted to mention, and just again, that we are having a seminar tomorrow, and it's called Juggling Caregiving. How apropos. And so you can contact us by visiting our website at Seabury, SEABURY, resources.org/events, and just sign up, and it's free to hear all about the facets of juggling that. To learn more about our care management program, seaburyresources.org/care management, and our information and referral line, you can reach us at 202-364-0020.
And in our last 30 seconds, Sandra, I'll give you the last 30. Any advice you would give for those family caregivers out there who may be struggling or may be indecisive or maybe just looking for some support in terms, whether it's just words of encouragement?
Absolutely. I would say make a plan, extend yourself grace, and don't be afraid to ask for support.
Well, that is great advice. We thank you both so much for being with us. Just an important conversation, great information, and we hope folks are able to use it and care for their loved ones in the way that will be helpful for both sides. Thank you both so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
All righty. That is the Daily Drum for this Wednesday, November 20th. I'm Vermonte Bryant, in for Harold Fisher. Have a great night. All right, let me hit it.